Good evening. I'm Stan Mark, Vice Chair of ClassACT HR 73, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Toolbox webinar entitled Effective Fundraising, presented by Ken Bartels and Nick Sakellariadis, both members of the class of 1973. I would now like to briefly introduce Ken and Nick. Ken was president and CEO of Paxton Properties, a real estate investment firm concentrating on Center City office buildings. Previously, he spent 17 years on Wall Street with Morgan Stanley and Citigroup in New York City and Tokyo. Ken has been on numerous nonprofit boards and is a graduate of HBS. He has also been co-chair of the Harvard College Fund for the class of 1973 with Nick for a number of years, so he has extensive experience in fundraising. Nick is co-chair and principal owner of the Dayton Dragons, a minor league affiliate of the Cincinnati Reds. Most of his career was spent as an investment banker with Citicorp. Nick is a graduate of HBS and the Harvard Law School and has served on a variety of nonprofit boards, and as mentioned, has been co-chair of the class of 1973 College Fund, where he has honed his fundraising skills. I think you are in for a treat as Ken and Nick share their wealth of information and experience regarding fundraising. Ken and Nick, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Stan, our classmate and long-term friend. And by the way, Stan and I are business school classmates as well. So we've seen each other a lot over the years in different reasons. So Nick and I are, as was said by Stan, we've been partners in this fundraising game for a very long time. Mostly about Harvard together, but we do a lot elsewhere also. And so we thought we would start this by talking about sort of four key aspects of a successful nonprofit that relate to their fundraising function. We're going to bounce back and forth, so you're going to see a lot of us, and we're each going to pipe up to the extent that we have points to add to something that the other person has already said. So let me start with the first point about successful nonprofits in particular respect to their fundraising. They all have the ability to state their mission in one sentence. It may not be in the material they send out, but they can state it in one sentence. So a couple of days ago when Nick and I were on the phone trying to prepare for this evening, he said, well, look, what would be your one sentence about the mission of the Harvard College Fund if you were to do that? And I sort of, well, Nick, I decided I'd actually put it in writing. So here it is. The mission of the Harvard College Fund is to gather the resources needed to sustain and enhance the excellence of Harvard College. So it's pretty short. It's pretty clear. A mission statement is, in effect, a short version of an elevator speech, but really short. And as Stan said, your question should be one sentence and a question mark at the end. A mission. If you can't say your mission in one sentence, then I think you've actually got some problems. Circumstances change, and maybe the mission changes. I mean, the classic metaphor for this is a buggy whip. But most of the time when nonprofits can't state their mission in one sentence, that means they're maybe unstable a little bit. There's some lack of clarity to what they actually do. A sister problem to this is mission creep, which is a problem in its own right. And if the nonprofit begins to creep a little bit, maybe it's a good idea. Very often it's not. And then the last point I want to make in this area is it is not an embarrassment to close down a nonprofit if it's not really fulfilling its mission anymore. I've done that. It was actually very difficult to do. We were a nonprofit that was registered in the state of New York, and New York State thought that that must be something fishy that these guys want to close down. Maybe they're taking all the money and heading to Brazil. It was really amazing. It took about a year and a half for the New York State Secretaries of State office, which is the regulator for this sort of stuff in New York State, to realize that we really were just shutting down, and that we distributed all the assets to various nonprofits that were similar to us, and that was that. So anyway, number one, state your mission in one sentence. Nick?
Thank you, Ken, and thanks, Stan, and hello to everybody who's on tonight. The second point here is somewhat obvious, but it's got to be addressed, directly. And it's just essential that you start off and you acknowledge that fundraising is going to be a core function if your nonprofit is going to succeed. Obviously, without resources, you can't accomplish the mission delivered in the one sentence that Ken talked about. And I think that defining what level of resources is needed is in itself a seminal event in the creation of your, nonprofit. And think of the exercise as needing to match your aspirations to your financial and other capabilities. So as an example, if your mission was to create 30 orphanages in Africa, in war-torn nations in Africa, and they each cost, to invent the number, $1 million a piece, that's the aspiration. But the capabilities, as you think about your fundraising, the capabilities may be that you can only raise $1 million. Well, the mission is not going to work. And that's a time perhaps not to give up, but rather to realign the aspirations with the capabilities. And for instance, open a single orphanage in Africa. And by the way, once you do that, and if you make that successful, the opportunities to open other orphanages later, the opportunities to open up fundraising capabilities later, once you have a win, will increase, exponentially. So focus on this right as you begin and try to realistically think about, gosh, given where I am in life, given, what resources I personally have, what resources I could get from friends for seed capital, if you will, and what the market is like for getting more funds, make that calculation as you're thinking about launching, the nonprofit.
Let me just add to what Nick said, and he used the word market just now. So our system of nonprofits addressing social needs, addressing the arts communities, a variety of reasons that nonprofits exist in the United States, very different from what happens in Europe and other developed parts of the world, where most of that function is really performed by government. They have much higher tax rates than we do in the United States. And that's how the Berlin Philharmonic, for example, to use one example, is virtually all funded by the city of Berlin and the federal government of Germany. We're different. In our case, it's all about markets, and you create a foundation. You need to address a market need, and the market aspect that really governs that is your ability to raise money. So, for example, there are right now something on the order of 1.8 million 501c3s in the United States. A big number. The last time I looked at that number, which was 4 or 5 years ago, was 1.5 million. So the number is growing. It's very easy to set up a nonprofit in the United States. If anyone's ever tried to do it, you'll learn that it's very easy to get a 501c3 letter from the government, which is a great thing. It ought to be easy to set up. But it's a fundamentally capitalist system here. If you are not successful at raising money, and if you're often not successful because your mission is really not being fulfilled properly, you get into trouble. So again, market matters. Laser focusing.
And before you go to that, let me just also add, just to kind of expand on my example of, let's say, setting up an orphanage, if that was the mission in a war-torn African country. You need to also focus in terms of your fundraising, not on the one-time expense of setting up the project, but you also have to focus on the dollars that are going to be needed to sustain the operation, going forward. It may cost $1 million to open up the bricks and mortars facility.
Okay, moving on to the donors. Critical aspect here is to focus on donors who are likely to engage. Um, for colleges and universities, with a pre-existing group of engaged potential donors like the likes of us, graduates of those places, it's easy. The challenge is for a new foundation that doesn't have a built-in engaged population that maybe isn't engaged in a monetary sense, but is engaged in other places. It's a bigger challenge. And identifying those who those likely donors will be is probably challenge number one for a new foundation. So how do you do it? The answer is you look at other foundations that are similar to what you do, that operate in geographic areas similar to what you're operating in, or operate in areas of activity, an given art form, for example, and kind of take it from there. Your government prepares or forces you to prepare, and it distributes. It's publicly available. It's something called a Form 990. Every 501c3 files that every year, and it's a pretty good document. And one of the things you can use it for is to figure out who's giving money to foundations that are similar to yours. Nick?
So that leads to, how do you jump in and connect with people who will help this operation work? And how do you build the network, for fundraising? And that has to do with engagement tools. And we're going to go over several of them, which include first, creating foundational documents, creating a board with fundraising capability, creating and updating a communication package, developing a PR strategy, contacting donors personally, sending direct mail electronically or through the old post office, appearing on panels, creating volunteer opportunities, holding events. These are a series of engagement tools that will expand your network and, allow you to build that fundraising capability that you need. Let me kick off, and Ken, please jump in on this as well. In terms of the first piece, as you come out of the box, you need to create your foundational documents. Ken has already referenced, the 501c3 filing to become a nonprofit so that your donors know that their dollars are tax deductible, and therefore there's a multiplier effect on the dollars that they're going to be willing to contribute. You've got a founding charter or some kind of a document to recognize the organization. You probably have to expand on the mission statement at this point. You probably have to think about a budget and or a business plan, and you probably have to pull together some fundraising marketing materials that might be fine-tuned for individuals, maybe some corporations, maybe some foundations. But I think when you're starting with these, smaller startup enterprises, your a big initial target base is going to be individuals. Ken, do you want to add to that?
I'm going to go to the next subject, which is related to it, which is creating a board that is fundraising oriented, or at least has the capability to do that. Boards are critical sources of funding for virtually every nonprofit that I'm aware of. Not every member of the board needs to have capacity, however, and there are reasons why people are on nonprofit boards that are not only because of fundraising. And two boards that I chaired at one point in the past each had a lot to do with the federal government, and we had on both of those boards we had a number of board members who were very valuable to us and to me, but their expertise was really in understanding how the federal government works and how that might help the foundation that we were both sharing on the board of. There's a phrase called give or get. You've probably heard that. You're either going to give money of a certain amount or get it from other sources. The get aspect is actually pretty rare. Lots of good talk about that, but most people are frankly not very good at raising money and not really interested in raising money. But you do hear that, and it sometimes is applicable. The other thing that you'll hear about is, and it's particularly true in arts organizations, arts boards, is the concept of dues, where there's an expectation that you're going to give a certain amount of money every year to that board and or that organization. It's not common in social service oriented nonprofits, but it is quite common in the arts world. So to sum up, the board really is a critical part of fundraising, and serious thought needs to be given right out of the box on who's on your board.
Yeah, they use the phrase of the 3 W's of, board contributions: wealth, wisdom, and work. Those are if you can find one person with all of those, that's fantastic. Sometimes you have to divide it up, amongst the board to get, the right blend, the right team that can push things forward. So while you're doing that, it's important to think about creating and then constantly updating and refining your communications package. The simplest one is, the website, and, getting that up and running, a handy, accessible vehicle where the mission statement can be reviewed, progress can be reviewed, important facts and trends and developments about the organization can be talked about. But the communications package also has to take into account that the website, in a sense, is passive. People have to reach out to you. You also need to be able to reach outside and induce people to get some interest. And it could be press releases. It could be outgoing communications and emails, etc. And to do that, though, there's an underlying principle here in your communications of building up your database. So start thinking about, all your friends and family who might conceivably help out, any other corporate or foundational contacts, anyone in the community who, while maybe not likely to contribute, might introduce you to people who could contribute, and building that database and continuously updating it and refining it so that you can have outreach to potentially interested volunteers and donors is essential, in addition to having the website with the core repository of information.
Let me just emphasize one point, which is the website. I'm on a board now that probably every 6 months completely refreshes its website. This is partly a generational thing. I think the younger people are interested in that, but it's also in the negative. If the website has here's a sentence, 2023 is a great year for us so far. When you see that on a website, when you go to that website in 2024, it tells you something about the quality of the work. That it could tell you something about the quality of work that's being done at that foundation. Your website is the window on the world now, and it's the window for others to look at you to see how you're doing. And if there are things like that that are on the website that are just out of date, it speaks to people's lack of attention and maybe some problems in operating the foundation. Public relations. Well, it's a great thing. It's free, or mostly free, if you go about it the right way. It could be a credibility building aspect to your work. The press acts as a filter. The press is not going to write about a foundation if they don't think it's particularly interesting. So there's an imprimatur aspect of getting good PR. You have to think hard about what kind of outlets you should be focused on, and that in turn relates back to the issue of who are the potential donors to your organization. They're the target in many ways of any PR aspect that you get yourself involved in. But if you're focused on some obscure area of the internet that your potential donors don't even know about, it's kind of a waste of time. So PR matters, but you got to be careful about how you go about it.
So the next very important component of engagement is personally contacting donors. This is the gold standard. It generally has the highest impact on fundraising. And this is something you should probably think about, in the opening weeks of putting together the organization. And it's almost, going through your contact list and running through and figuring out who could remotely have an interest in this particular cause, and putting that list down and starting prioritizing them, ranking them in order of priority in terms of that sweet spot of they have resources and you have some kind of connection with them where the resources might be deployed. And a way to break the ice for particularly a new venture is not so much to say, hey, do you happen to have a spare $10,000? But it's, I've got this great idea. I've been interested in Africa, to use my African orphanage example, for years. I have this mousetrap. This country needs this desperately. Can I come by and ask for your advice? I haven't done this before. And, it's very hard. It's very easy to turn down a request for money. It's much harder to turn down a request for advice from friends or people with whom you're connected. So try that as an approach and rank order all your personal contacts. And from that, you'll expand out the network because, first of all, hopefully the initial people you contact may get involved at some level, but they may also be able to tell you, oh my gosh, I've got XYZ friend and he started an orphanage in Indonesia. You really must talk to that person, etc. It takes some creativity to break through to get the contribution, especially kind of larger dollars. And you probably have two subsets. You could go to you could identify a group of people who have never given philanthropically, and therefore they have capacity, and you want to tag on to them. I would say that's probably a long shot. And it's better to go to people who have a history, as you're going through prioritizing your potential donors, who have a history of giving philanthropically. That's the good news. The bad news is when you grab them, particularly if the donors are kind of in our generation, they've had 50 years to develop and get committed to various fundraising opportunities, and it's hard to break through. So as you go through this list, you need to be creative. I'll give you one example where we had a real good breakthrough. This is for our local church. It's a Greek Orthodox church, and the community had drifted out to the suburbs, needed to do a big restoration project, didn't have a lot of internal, capacity. But, we reached out, started snooping around who had been involved in the church, who might be involved in the church. And we discovered that one of the richest Greek Orthodox guys in the country had been an altar boy at the church 50 years ago. He had subsequently moved on to another church, but we, through a friend of a friend of a friend, we got through to him, contacted him, asked for advice, asked him to come to the church, asked him and his wife to come to the church and sit down with us and inspect the properties and see if he could give us some advice on how we could access builders at a low. He had a construction business too, so it was a natural. But the other great detective work we did through someone who remembered his mother and father in the church was discovered that arni aguinades, which is lamb with artichokes and egg lemon sauce, a delicious meal, was his favorite meal. So a couple of the ladies in the church who were superb chefs, he did the tour of the church. He's on his way out. We intercept him and plop this entire homemade feast, in the church hall, and pin him and his wife down for another hour and a half. He's just totally taken away. And we got the magic response. His wife looked at him and said, "How can we not help?" So, he has now been a supporter for 40 years. that's the kind of research and work you need to do to try to break through to some donors and find things that will create, a personal connection. Now, you can't do that with everyone, but again, as you rank order your particular potential donors, think about what personal or historical or other connection can really tie them back into your organization. And remember, it's going to be prepared. It is not a one-day process, a month process, a year process. If you're going to do it right and you're going to be successful, it's going to be a multi-year process, and be ready for that.
I've got one anecdote that's not as good as that one, but speaks to the personal aspect of how this should ideally work. It's a nonprofit that was interested in having me join the board, and so they reached out to one of our two sons and asked that son whether or not he'd be interested in coming by the offices and kind of learning a little more about the work of this particular foundation. And he did do that, and came back with a pretty good report on this group and what they did. And about 6 months later, I joined the board. So there are all sorts of ways. It could be a Greek lamb, or it could be kidnapping your kid for 2 hours. But one way or another, there's the personal side really matters. Email, direct mail is kind of the old phrase for it, but these days it's email. I guess the first question, we all get too many emails, and we send them to spam and unsubscribe and all that. But I use email as one way to sort of keep my ear to the ground on politics, for example. I receive emails from all kinds of organizations across a broad spectrum, and my purpose in doing that, I skim through them just to sort of see what the communists are thinking about these days. That, to take an example. But is the email, are the emails you send out just blather, or they're actually value add? And it's tough to assess whether or not they're really value add. But one way to think about it is an email that has a story in it is usually a better email than just kind of just bragging about this and how many KPIs we have and how frequently we fulfill these various things. I look at all that and my eyes glaze over. The other issue that often happens is you get too many emails from one foundation, particular cause or foundation, and sometimes I just unsubscribe just because of the sheer volume. It's a pain to look through all this stuff. So you have to be careful about how much email. Emails, the incremental email, the cost of sending out an incremental email is practically zero. So why not? Let's send out another email. That does have costs in the form of people who just lose interest and unsubscribe. I've got one nonprofit that sends me the same email 2 or 3 times just to make sure that I read it. Did you read it? Did you read it the first time? Well, here, we'll send it again. And then the last point about email is to the extent you can personalize them, and there are ways to accomplish that. I'm known as Ken. When an email refers to me as Kenneth, that's of course a negative, because it means that I'm getting an email from someone who doesn't know me, and I probably therefore don't know them. So you have to be careful, but personalization is another way to accomplish all of that. Nick?
So that brings up the old-fashioned direct mail. It's probably, for a startup, it's probably a little costly and too much of a pain to actually send those out as compared to the efficiency of doing email. But the physical literature more broadly probably still has its usage. You look at some of the baseball world and so forth. During COVID, they went to QR codes for the traditional playbooks you'd give that would give a summary of what was happening in the game and so forth. Broadway did the same thing on their playbills and such. But I think both universes found that the patrons really like that physical memento of the game and the ability to kind of flip the pages. It's an easier way to digest information in a sense than putting it on your tiny phone and trying to scroll through it. et cetera. So there is probably still a role. It's costly because of the printing and so forth, but there is a selective role on, the old-fashioned, written, documents. Occasionally, maybe there's an annual something special that's sent out to really kind of hit home. But you may find that those kinds of brochures and materials are helpful for in-person events you may have.
I'm going to add one plug here, which is the virtue of a handwritten note. They're rarer and rarer, but they're still pretty effective. And people who receive them, first of all, they're sort of personal by nature, right? Or often are. Sometimes they're not actually, but most of the time they are. And they also understand that when you sit down to write a handwritten note, it takes some time, and therefore demonstrates, it is a material demonstration of the fact that you care about the organization and you care about them. A reasonable substitute for that is you'll get a fundraising, again, I guess by definition, it would be physical fundraising, physical message, a letter, paper letter. But when people add a little note to the letter, they're doing a big mailing, they bring in 15 people on the board, they divide up the list, and they, dear Bob, be great if you can help out again this year. That's not effective. It's not the same thing as a full handwritten note, but the personalization of that really helps. Appearing on panels is a very good way to it's not unlike PR in the sense that it gives you, it's free. Maybe there's some travel costs associated with it, but if you're on a panel and asked to speak, it underscores some degree of credibility. They wouldn't invite you to be on a panel if you weren't considered to be someone that understands the world in which the nonprofit is operating and have something interesting to say to an audience. But they're also valuable in other ways. If it's a typical panel I'm thinking about is 3 or 4 people and all, I'll use Nick's phrase of Africa or its orphanages. And so the others on the panel often have interesting things to say too, and you pick up ideas from them that you otherwise might not if you weren't on that panel. I mentioned earlier that there are 1.8 million nonprofits in the United States now. It's a lot. Over the years, I found it extremely difficult to merge nonprofits, and it's actually a very rare event. There are lots of reasons for that. Some are negative, like people don't think the other guy's any good, and I'm better than you are, and I want to be the president, and you can't be the president. All that sort of nonsense. Social issues they're referred to as in the M&A business on Wall Street, but they're real in the case of nonprofits, and it's one of the reasons why there are 1.8 million nonprofits, because there are, in my view, way too many nonprofits in the United States. A certain amount of destructive competition would be helpful, I think, in the nonprofit world. And in fact, twice I have attempted to merge nonprofits, and twice I failed. And in one case, it was clearly social issues that caused it to fail. In the other case, it was more substantive. But in any event, it's very difficult. But one way to figure out whether or not you're a merger candidate is to get to know some people that are on panels with you, and maybe something, not full merger, maybe there's something we could do together, which would be beneficial. Nick?
So another engagement tool to consider, and this is probably a lower hanging fruit and something that can be done at an early stage, is to create volunteer opportunities. So there may be people who don't necessarily want to give cash, et cetera, but they may be friends who could be imposed upon to provide services, either at a discount or for free. An artist friend who might design the web page or the logo of the institution, or if you're doing a printed document, something that goes on the cover. A business friend who could review your business plan and or give you suggestions on how to construct the business plan. A lawyer to, take care of any filings required to set up, the institution, an accountant to help you do your filings, a rich person who might have a venue that maybe not willing, not enough involved in the institution, wants to write a check, but if it's someone you're friendly with, you might impose upon them, gee, could we use your home or your country home or your garden to have a get together for our board and important volunteers. So that's a way to kind of draft new volunteers. And then above and beyond that, of the people who are already, active, making sure that there are opportunities for them to bond and meet over cookouts, barbecues, conversations, a day at the theater, a day at the ballpark. These are important, ways to build, the networking.
The last subject, which is events. Events is a broad subject, broad term, broad word, but it can mean everything from small, intimate dinners. We're focused on a small number of typically large potential donors, to events that are focused on lots of people. 5K races with an entry fee that's big enough for some money left over after the organizational aspects of putting together a race like that. Christmas fairs. Nantucket, where we go, there's a tradition of every Thanksgiving, the local library, Athenaeum up there, fancy name, but it's a library, sponsors the turkey plunge. It happens in Thanksgiving morning. These days in Nantucket, the water's pretty cold, so people gather on a particular beach. They pay, I think it's $100 to enter this. You get a T-shirt out of it, but everybody runs into the cold water and lasts about 10 seconds and then runs out again. President Biden, and his family have been spending Thanksgiving on Nantucket for decades, including as he's been president. So the Secret Service will no longer allow him to do the turkey plunge, but he apparently was a reliable turkey plunger for many, many years. Again, that's not big running raiser, but it's creates lots of goodwill. I have some particular opinions about galas. Jane and I go to fewer and fewer galas. We find them to be very painful. So the most painful aspects for me, and for us, I should say, are, first of all, the live auction. You're sitting there and you kind of want to go home, and some guy's trying to get you to bid for this or that, a weekend home in Stowe, Vermont, or something like that. I dislike the fact that people, when you're trying to talk to the person next to you who you either know or maybe you don't know, but you'd like to get to know her or him a little bit better. And in the meantime, someone's giving a speech about some terrific thing that that particular foundation is doing. I do think that there is a role for entertainment if it's an arts organization, a theater company. I was many years on this theater company board. We would always have actors do a little skit, or actors that could also sing, who would sing. And if it's not an arts organization, but it's some kind of a, I don't know, organization that has some substance, a panel is a good idea. Interview a prominent person whose opinions on Nick's Africa would be of interest. So galas are important fundraisers, but you got to be pretty thoughtful about how you organize it, and don't end up cheesing people off because people kind of don't like it. And if that's the way they think, I'm not going to give so much money this year to that organization. Well, we've talked enough. I think it's time for you all who are listening to us ask questions or put out some ideas. So I think the mechanics are that Stan is going to now recognize anyone that has a question.
Let's get those questions. I know a lot of you out there. I don't want to point anybody out, but let's see the first hand. Otherwise, I'll have to ask the question. Well, I'll ask the question. Ken and Nick, if I was starting a nonprofit tomorrow, what would be the first thing I would do in relative to fundraising?
Nick?
Well, yeah, in this group, there's a natural. Find one of your friends who started a nonprofit who's affiliated with ClassACT, spring for a lunch, sit down with that person and walk through what the process was like. What were the first things they did? What was painful? What would they have done differently knowing what they know today? And I think that's probably where I would start, just because we've hit you with like a laundry list. No one can possibly do all these things at the same time at the beginning of the creation, of an organization or even in the mid part of it. And so actually talking to some founders of these nonprofits and finding out how they approached it, I think could be incredibly helpful as a first step.
What about the other end of it? Your nonprofit is going fairly well. You have a big grant from a foundation, and you don't get it this year, and it's key to your survival. How do you survive when something like that goes away?
You cut your budget. I've been through that a lot, and foundations often move on. They think that they have limited money. They're not endless, and they want to rotate through another theater company, for example, an experience that I've had more than once. Or they may think you're not doing a particularly good job, and it's really important to find out why they're not funding. The people that give away money at foundations are actually usually quite thoughtful in how they go about their work, and they may have feedback that would be very valuable to you. So it's an opportunity to learn something, but it's also an opportunity to look at your own expenses and cut. I earlier today was on a call where the executive director announced that they were budgeting a $400,000 planning to lose money, and they hoping that they would make it up by extraordinary new generosity. And boy, when I learned that, I said, think again.
Mhm.
I think you don't want to rule out new generosity, but I think probably at a minimum, to get that new generosity, the organization probably has to show some financial discipline. In other words, if the whole is 400, if you can go out and to your top donors and say, hey, we got hit by this one-time foundational cut. We're going to readjust our budget down a couple $100,000. Can you kind of match the internal sacrifice we're doing? I'd at least take a shot at that before giving up all the services that need to be cut.
Yeah. I see Cynthia Tam has a question.
Yes, hi. I
Hi.
am with Native Finance Development Corporation. We are a nonprofit with a mission to bring safe and culturally relevant banking and financial services to Indian reservations. As a tribal nonprofit, our board, by some requirements, need to be all tribal only. So my question is, if we were to go out and fundraise with philanthropists, would they feel less than if they are not on the board, but they're in a separate fundraising committee or fundraising board in particular?
So I think you're asking would it be a good idea to have a sort of an advisory committee? The people on that committee, people on your board must by statute or by charter must be Native Americans, but you still want to get them involved in some way. Is that kind of what you're asking?
I would like the non-native philanthropists to participate, and I would like your opinion as to how to structure that committee or that advisory board.
Right. So yes. Let me say the most important thing about that, because this is an issue I've dealt with more than once in various nonprofits, is if you're going to have an advisory committee, and people do, I'm thinking back a few decades ago, each big bank in America had an international advisory committee. It was composed of men, almost always men, the chief executive of a big French company, the chief executive of a big company in Japan, and so forth. So you look at that and say, oh boy, great to have all these folks involved. They're really important. The key thing from a staff point of view is to make sure that you actually ask these people to do something. People are tired of being asked to lend their name and then not asked to do anything of substance. So the first question is, are you, as an organization, sufficiently staffed to pay attention to people like that, and give them something to do that's meaningful? It's not just lending their name. But if you think it through carefully, an advisory committee of some sort it can be a useful thing to have, and in particular in your situation, where because of charter or statute, you have to be a Native American in order to be on the board.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Nick, you mentioned the word matching, and one thing that always comes up when you donate, there's a line there to check: does your company match your donation? How effective is that? And is it only for large nonprofits, or does it relate to any nonprofit?
Well, it depends. It depends on the corporation's policies, but generally the corporations, in my experience, are generally flexible for legitimate 501c3, enterprises. So I don't know that we've raised in my experience a ton of money through the matching, program. But it's incremental money, it's free. And, if a donor is going to put in 1,000 and can put in 2,000 for you by using the match, take it every day of the week.
Yeah. I was just wondering if it's an effective use of time of the nonprofit to push their donors to try to multiply their gift.
I think... I think it's probably worth a sentence in any solicitation, or, just to reference, don't forget, if you have matching funds, to please help us out on that basis. But I wouldn't make that the centerpiece of the fundraising activity.
I agree.
Good. Any other questions? Well, it's we're beating the time, so it's before 8 o'clock. Thank you, Ken and Nick. Thank you all for attending. The video from this event will be posted on our website. You will receive an email when this an evaluation. So please fill out the evaluation form. Please feel free to share the information in this link with others. Our next webinar will be in February, so please watch for emails with all the details of the upcoming program. And if you have any topics that you are very interested in, please let us know. And we'd love to have new presenters, new ideas, and new topics. So thank you so much for your attendance. Have a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you so much.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays.